Good morning, everyone. I forgot to record my sermon during the service, so I'm just recording it now. So when I was 15, I belonged to the Lutheran Church Canada, and that year we happened to have our National Youth Gathering at Jasper Park Lodge. Well, I thought I had died and went to heaven. I had never seen such luxury. I had never seen a king-size bed with the fluffiest duvet ever, surrounded by the most beautiful scenery I'd ever seen. I promised myself when I was older I would return there every year. I even stole the room key, the huge brass thing, and put it in my memory box to remind me of this goal. So fast forward a few years after that, I was 17, I graduated from high school, and I decided that I was going to take a gap year, a year off just to work. And I decided that I wanted to work at Jasper Park Lodge. Unfortunately, due to the season, it was too late for me to apply, and they weren't hiring, so I did manage to get a job at another resort. I was so excited, and I couldn't wait to move to Jasper. And I don't really know what my parents thought. They didn't really say much, but they did drive me there since I didn't have a car and I didn't drive. So the hotel that hired me had given me a shared apartment at the edge of Jasper, and I brought my bike to commute back and forth to work. I remember as I entered the apartment, my excitement quickly went away. It did not feel like home. It was dark and dirty and smelled like cigarette smoke. And I tried to push that aside and just be excited about what my new journey was. And that first night was so scary. I had realized I made a huge mistake. After a restless night, I woke up and I rode my bike to work. And I quickly realized this was not Jasper Park Lodge, and even if it was very different being a housekeeper than a guest. I remember riding my bike home that night, and I cried all the way home. Back to my apartment, and I cried all night long. In the morning, I woke up and I called my dad, not my mom, my dad. I knew he was a sucker, so I called him. And I was crying so hard, he said, "I'm coming to get you." So 3 hours later, he arrived to pick me up. And they didn't say, "I told you so." They said nothing. They just opened their arms and embraced me. And as I arrived home, I had a new appreciation for what it meant, what home meant, a place that was full of love, a place I was accepted unconditionally, a place I was comfortable. I have thought endlessly this week about home, and I've talked to many people, and the answers are always different of what home means to them. I remember Ray Goodship, the minister at Cochrane United Church, once preaching about home, and he was talking about his first Christmas. He went to Cochrane, and he had two sons who had never been in his new home, and one had never even been to Cochrane before. Yet, when they were talking about Christmas, his son said they were both could not wait to come home. And I spoke to Antonina and Colin this week, and Antonina said she feels that both Canada and Belarus are her home, and Colin really feels that Calgary and Winnipeg are his home. And this week I visited a lovely elderly lady who still lives in her home that she and her husband bought 55 years ago. Her husband passed away recently, and she's receiving a lot of pressure from her family to move. And she truly feels she cannot leave home. The memories and the comfort is too precious for her. For her home is filled with joyous memories and painful recollection of her last hours with her husband. Yet, this is the place that she needs to be. I'm sure all of you have countless stories of what makes you feel at home. Memories of your home, past and present. And I ask you that maybe after the sermon you reflect on what these memories and home means to you. Originally, what inspired me to write this sermon on home was our passage for today from Jeremiah. And I will talk about that passage a little bit. But as I thought endlessly about home this week, I suddenly remembered a quilt that hung on my wall right outside my office at Hillhurst. My desk actually faced this wall, so whenever I looked up at it, I would see the quilt. I had quite the time this week trying to get a picture of this, as I had asked Anne, and Anne passed it on to John, and John passed it on to somebody else, and so when I got the picture, it was actually just a blurry photo of a quilt that I could barely make out. But the theme of this quilt is home, and it has little squares of pictures of houses, bird houses, and other houses on it. And I'll just work my way through the quilts. The sayings on the quilts are, by wisdom, a house is built, by understanding and established, Proverbs 24, verse 3. How lovely is your dwelling place, Psalm 84, verse 1. What kind of house will you build for me, Acts 7:49. Even the sparrow has a home, Psalm 84, verse 3. She looks well to the way of her household, Proverbs 31, verse 27. To be busy at home is to be kind, Titus 2, verse 5. A house divided cannot stand, Matthew 12:25. Like a wise man who builds his house on a rock, Matthew 7, verse 24. He has built his house like a spider's web, Job 27, verse 18. Blessed are those who dwell in your house, Psalm 84, verse 4. And peace to this house, Luke 10, verse 5. As you can see, the Bible has a lot to say about homes and houses, both physically and spiritually. And please remember this as I talk about the passage in Jeremiah, that homes are both spiritual and physical. When we think of the ways people describe home, I keep on thinking of the Israelites. Throughout the Bible and history, they are continually separated from the Holy Land, sometimes for generations, yet they still felt that was home. Like Antonin and Colin, who feel their home is in two different places. Home for the Israelites could have been in Egypt and Israel, or Babylon and Israel. Like Ray's kids, many of them had never been home, yet they considered it home. The very thought of home comforted them and gave them hope. So I ask you, is there a time in your life where you have been comforted by the concept of home? The book of Jeremiah was written about 1,000 years after the Israelites landed back in the Promised Land, after their exodus from Egypt. The prophet himself is not in exile, but in Judah, land of promise. His oracle thus speaks to multiple audiences. Most directly, he speaks to those who remain in Judea and Israel, whose children, parents, brothers and sisters, friends, neighbors, and extended family and neighbor tribes have been taken from them. First by Assyria over a century before, and most recently by Babylon. He also speaks to the homeland. He speaks to those now in exile, the people of Israel and Judah, who've been deported from their homeland against their will. So there was a war, and they were taken away from their homeland. Others, as the deported tribes of Israel, of Ephraim, have been lost in place and time, and they were connected only now in memory and tradition and hope. The oracle focuses especially on the remnants of Israel, lost to their brothers and sisters in Judah and Samaria, scattered to the corners of the earth, and only God knows where they have been taken, and only God can bring them back home. So in this oracle, Jeremiah is promising deliverance from the scattered people of Israel, that they will once again return to the Holy Land, and their homecoming will be joyful. Their homecoming offers the Israelites hope when things seem hopeless. Now, I'm not totally naive. I understand the concept of home is not always comforting. Some of you might have grown up in abusive homes, lived or live in abusive homes. No home is perfect, although we may idolize them. And things back in the Israelites' homeland were not perfect as well. There was injustices and suffering, especially if you were poor. The rich kept on getting richer and at the expense of the poor, but it was home. But what does this mean? Why is a place they've never been so comforting for them? Why is a place that there are injustices and suffering and often war so comforting to them? Maybe, just maybe, it's not the actual building, or the city or the land that comforts them. And us, perhaps it's a concept of familiarity that comes with a sense of belonging, maybe community. My grandmother is Dutch, and I have been to Holland twice, once for a week and a couple other times at the airport for a few hours. Yet I still feel a connection to Holland. I grew up surrounded by my Dutch relatives. I love salted licorice, something most people hate. I find comfort when I see Delft pottery because my grandmother had it scattered throughout her house. These things bring me back to my grandmother, someone who is very familiar to me, someone I knew who loved me. So perhaps the concept of home is really a feeling that connects you with somebody or something of comfort and memories. In this passage, God assures us and his people that God will deliver them. More than that, God promises to be the father to them, a protector, somebody who will provide security and love and comfort to them, just like home. In a time of chaos, God offers the Israelites salvation, escape, rescue, recovery, an amazing promise when nothing around you feels familiar or comfortable. God offers that to us. In February, you've all heard the phrase, home is where the heart is. What if we returned home and nothing was familiar? Would it be comforting? I led a service in February for Holocaust Remembrance Day, and we heard from a lady who was just a toddler when the war started and returned home at the age of 8. And nothing was left. No friends, no family. All of her house belongings had been stolen. All her family was gone. And the only thing that felt familiar to her was her mother. The only hope that they found was a relative in Canada who was willing to help them immigrate. For them, Canada became the promised land, a land of possibilities. They found hope where there was none. And just like the Israelites, they found hope in Jeremiah's oracle. They found hope in Canada. Perhaps home is a place that offers us hope. If we go back to what I said earlier, that the Bible has a lot to say about houses and homes, some of them physical and some of them spiritual, I think we find a lot of hope in the concept of a spiritual home. It offers comfort when we lose somebody, when we are sick, when we think about dying. But I think metaphorically, the concept of the promised land is also spiritual. Even now, when Christians think of visiting Israel, it's a spiritual journey, not just a place of vacation. Perhaps Jeremiah was not just talking about physical homecoming. Perhaps in this oracle, he's talking about a spiritual homecoming. God gathering the people together once again to renew their faith, renew their spirit for God, which will bring forth great joy, kind of like a church, us gathering on Sunday. There's emphasis on this passage of bringing together diverse groups into unity. These fragments are not yet people. They are only scattered, disorganized groups and families with no unity. There's great news, work of God unfolding in their midst. It is for the purpose of taking these scattered individuals and family units and forging them into people, creating a family and eventually a home. And God is setting up home for all of God's people to gather. Not a physical home, because nothing is familiar to them, but a spiritual home where they can gather and worship and with fellowship and unite with God. I think sometimes we get so caught up in individualism of our culture that we are tempted to think that we that the return from exile is an individual thing. It's easy to get sentimental and personalize the experience of this event into a warm fuzziness that makes us feel good. But unless we place this in the context of the creation of people, a community, we have misunderstood what God is about in this event. Even when we think about the incarnation, yet another return from exile, it's not about individual salvation, it's about creation of a redeeming community of faith that can be the people of God in the world with all the responsibility that entails of making the world a better place. No home is not an individual concept. It's a feeling of comfort that comes from familiarity, comfort that is not individual, but building of a community. This week, I put on the church sign outside the church the story of the story of who we are and all we love. I put this here for a reason. I think the church as the church as a home. I've only been here for a few weeks, yet this place feels familiar to me. I actually feel a sense of belonging. I felt this before I even arrived. I feel welcome here. I spend so much time here, it feels like a second home. Each one of you have a story about the first time you came to Parkdale, stories about Parkdale. There are people you love here. If nothing else, it's a place where you can come and feel God's love. What I hope for is that everyone who comes through these doors feels they're accepted, that they feel some kind of comfort from being here, a sense of community, familiarity with a sense of home, spirituality, and both physical and spiritual. Amen.